I'd like to thank everyone who's just joined us for tonight's program, Legacies of European Jewry, tonight's Yom HaShoah commemoration and program. Thank you for being here. We will start in just 1 or 2 minutes as everyone gets connected. Thank you. All right, Fred, are you okay with me starting?
Yes, please, go right ahead. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna click the record button. Good evening. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you this evening to our Yom HaShoah commemoration organized by the UConn Center for Judaic Studies and specifically our UConn Stamford campus. I'm very grateful to my colleague, Professor Fred Roden, who I will introduce in a moment, who has helped organize this evening's program. My name is Avi Noam Pat. I'm the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut, where I also serve as the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies. You will note, as I have indicated in the chat, we are delighted by the overwhelming response to this evening's program. So many of you joining us for this year's annual Yom HaShoah commemoration on the legacies of European Jewry, the second generation and beyond. This program is being recorded in case you would like to share it with anyone, and we will share a link with everyone after the program. And we are also live streaming tonight's program on the UConn Center for Judaic Studies YouTube page, and that is available. The address is available in the chat below. Just a couple of technical notes before I turn it over to Fred. Tonight's program, everyone who has entered the program will be muted as you enter to dissipate the number of distractions that we have, but we do very much want to encourage you to ask questions of our speakers. And so we would like for you to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that you might have as we're going through the program. Professor Roden, who will be our MC tonight, will moderate a discussion at the end of the 3 presentations with our wonderful speakers, Leora Tech, Andrew Zalewski, and Ralph Berger, and we'll have a chance to answer questions from all of them. So it is a great pleasure for me to turn the floor, or I should say to turn the screen over to my colleague, Frederick Roden, from the Department of English at the University of Connecticut, Stamford. Professor Roden is a distinguished scholar with multiple research interests in religion and literature, Victorian studies, LGBTQ history and theory, Holocaust studies, and medievalism. He's the author of Same-Sex Desire in Victorian Religious Culture, the editor of Palgrave Advances in Oscar Wilde Studies, and numerous works, including Love's Trinity, a companion to Julian of Norwich, the editor of Jewish Christian Queer, Crossroads and Identities, Recovering Jewishness, Modern Identities Reclaimed. And I think I will stop myself there. You can see he's a very distinguished scholar, and it's a real pleasure to turn the screen over to him to be moderator this evening, and he will introduce our distinguished panel. Thank you so much, Fred.
Well, Avi, Professor Pat, I have to say that it's a good thing that my lighting makes me orange, because otherwise people would be noticing I was blushing after that very lovely introduction that you gave me. I have to turn back to Professor Pat and express my tremendous gratitude for him not only providing our incredible technical support here, and I have to point that out because there are several of us who self-identify as Luddites here, and we want to have a successful event, and Professor Pat stepped in and said he'd be more than happy to coordinate that. I'm very grateful. I'd like to also give a shout out to say that before I provide information about tonight's event, I know that Professor Pat is going to be giving a Yom HaShoah lecture about his new book for the JDC on Thursday, and perhaps Professor Pat will be able to share in the chat some information about how folks might be able to go about registering for that. If that's possible, I see a thumbs up, so that would be terrific. So again, we're very fortunate to have Professor Pat as the Conover Chair, as well as the Director for the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. And in recent years, I have been serving in the role at the Stamford campus of UConn in coordinating our reinvention of the program. Now, this panel that we are excited to have tonight was in fact intended to be in person in April 2020. And we decided that when we couldn't be in person in April 2021, we would in fact be Zooming, because the Stamford campus of University of Connecticut has had a long history of having its own events for Yom HaShoah, insofar as recognizing at this particular time the importance of Holocaust memory, but also what I might call, apropos our particular topic for this panel, the future of the Jewish past. Not only the legacies of European Jewry, as we entitled this panel, but how we see the future of the work that we're doing collectively. And as in recent years, it has been very important for me to think about the impact of what we're doing for our undergraduate students at the University of Connecticut, Stamford. Likewise, we think of the future building on a center that for some 40 years has provided in the Fairfield County community lifelong learning in person and now via Zoom. I'm going to make a quick remark about that and to say that I have relied on the very, very rich work that Professor Pat has done in the past year of ensuring that many things have been available through distance while we were not doing work in person. I happen to have been on sabbatical, and we very much look forward, for those of you who are local in the Stamford area, to resuming our programming in person, God willing, in fall 2021, and hopefully far beyond that. So as we look to tonight's panel, I'd like us to think a little bit about those wonderful folks who are joining us for it. I will be putting into the chat some particular links they've provided me with that will enable you to know more about their work, but particularly for those of you who have research interests in this field, to know how their particular resources in quite different ways can enable you to learn more about this history and how it is in fact a living history. With that in mind, our panel is going to go in the following order, and I'll just say a few words about each of our panelists before presenting them more fully. And that's to say, we will be starting with Dr. Andrew Zalewski, who's affiliated with the organization Gesher Galicia, that has done extensive work insofar as providing what I will call the quantitative aspect of this panel. And quantitative is a bit of a shorthand for saying, for those who do work in the regions of what was known as Galicia, the genealogical work, the historical work of towns and villages, this is an invaluable resource, and we're very grateful to Dr. Zalewski for participating tonight. we'll be concluding our panel with Leora Tech, who has founded the HaShoah project, as well as Bridge to Poland. It's very, very much about the relationships between present day Poles and present day folks of Polish Jewish heritage in thinking about, as we're saying, the future of the Jewish past. And therein, we have a lot of collaborations insofar as the artistic recreations and work with theater, for instance, documentation also through various forms of narrative. Our central presenter, however, in the panel is Ralph Berger, who most traditionally shares with us the work of narrative, insofar as he will be sharing with us information about his own parents' story that he and his brother edited. And by coincidence, Dr. Tech, Nechama Tech, the mother of Leora, my distinguished colleague and beloved friend who'd written a book on the Bielski partisans, in fact, shares that history of the Bielski partisans with Mr. Berger's family story, which you'll have much to learn about shortly. But before I go there, let me just tell you a few more words about our folks that are going to be with us tonight. And again, I'm just going to do this in order here. Leora, I would like to again share this mention insofar as her work with her organizations Bridge to Poland and the HaShoah project. She's published a number of works dealing with these issues of an inclusive model of memory work in Poland, as well as focusing on work with theater groups in Poland. So I will direct you to her particular websites by putting those in the chats. By training, she's an attorney with a law degree from Duke and a bachelor's degree from Wellesley, and we're delighted to have her with us tonight. Mr. Berger, Ralph Berger, is likewise an attorney, and with his brother Albert had co-edited their parents' works. And I'm going to let their story insofar as the Bielski Brigade come up in his work, but I should say that he is a much dedicated member of the Holocaust memory community insofar as continuing that work in the United States and beyond in a very, very deep way. And again, Dr. Zalewski, who's vice president of the organization Gesher Galicia, is himself a physician who is working in this organization and is the author of 2 books on Galicia. So it's quite exciting to have the 3 of them here. And I'm going to turn the floor first to Andrew, Dr. Zalewski, to get us started. And you'll find that I'll be putting into the chat those necessary links that can get you to their particular information. So without further ado, Dr. Zalewski.
Thank you, Fred. Let me bring my slides up. Great. Well, thank you very much, Fred, for this kind invitation and introduction. And it is a great honor to be with all of you tonight and take part in this important evening. I'm also delighted to share this virtual stage with Leora and Ralph, and I look forward to their commentaries and insightful input into a discussion that will be coming. What I would like to do over the next 10-15 minutes to talk a little bit about the concept of people and places. The nexus between the two is pivotal to the work of Gesher Galicia, focusing on archival research and educational activities, concentrating on Jewish communities of Galicia. This concept, this paradigm of people and places seems to me important on 2 levels. On an individual level, it is important to all of us to remember, to discover our own family's past, but also in a broader context, what we are discussing today, people and places is a paradigm pivotal to our celebration of once vibrant communities in Europe. So let us begin by looking briefly at a Jewish world, Ashkenazi world in Eastern and Central Europe at the dawn of 20th century. The largest concentration of Jews lived at that time under Russian rule. Here it is Pale of Settlement and Russian Poland. The second largest Jewish community could be found in Austria-Hungary. More than 2 million Jews lived under the Habsburg rule. In a different sense, looking at this map and these numbers, this image shows us a perimeter of centuries-old Ashkenazi civilization that developed in Central and Eastern Europe. For members of Gesher Galicia, the area of particular interest is the former province of Austria-Hungary by the name of Galicia, home of the largest Jewish community under the Habsburg rule. Yet today, you won't find the name of Galicia on contemporary maps. For those who may be unfamiliar with this part of the past, the concept of Austrian Galicia might be difficult to grasp. It was formed as an accident of geopolitical circumstances. This province resonated not just with one, but many foreign sounds and foreign languages, and Jewish memories of Galicia oscillate from a tremendous pride in the family past to the sorrow brought by the events of the 20th century. So let us briefly dive a little bit deeper into people and places, focusing on Jewish Galicia. Majority of Jews of Galicia lived in so-called market towns. Here we are looking at an unfinished sketch from 1848 of a typical market town in Eastern Galicia by the name of Bohorodchany. About 50% of the population was Jewish, so not surprisingly, we find on this map a synagogue. Another 30% were Ukrainians, so not surprisingly, we find Orthodox Greek Catholic Church. And the remaining 20% of inhabitants of this particular town were Poles who attended Roman Catholic Church. But let us focus, zoom in on the market area, the typical part of the town, Galician town, where one can find many Jewish homes, Jewish shops. With the help of the records that Gesher Galicia collects, acquires, researches, and indexes for the benefit of all Jewish genealogists, we can perhaps determine who lived where. And in fact, in Bohorodchany, we are for a double treat, I might say. The records allow us to show not only Jewish names, but also this transition between traditional patronymic names and permanent hereditary surnames that Galician Jews adopted in 1788. And of course, if the records are available, one can add to this two-dimensional map who lived where additional layers, additional generations. In 1848, the very same year that the map that I just showed you was drafted, Galicia was swept by the wave of political upheavals. Jews and Gentiles signed various petitions about the pressing issues of the day. Here is one or two samples of one of the petitions that we found in Austrian state archives. On the left is a page, one of many, from the town of Bohorodchany that we just visited. And here you could see columns and rows of individual signatures. In fact, member of Gesher Galicia, Julian David, was able to find in this list not just one, but two of his ancestors Ozias David, and Leib Rigger. So as you begin to see, with the help of those records, we can not only anchor individual members of our family trees to the towns, perhaps sometimes even identify the house where they lived, but also we can glean what those past generations stood for. And in fact, the petitions also give us some level of Jewish acculturation in the mid of 19th century. As you could see, some signatories felt comfortable signing the petition only in Hebrew, while others signed in the languages of the Gentiles, adding few words in Polish or in German. So again, we are stripping some level of historical secrecy, if you will, looking at people and places. So with the information from vital records, population censuses, from petitions and many other records and maps, those old vintage postcards suddenly become much sharper in focus. Here we see the market area from the town of Bohorodchany, the very one that we just saw on the map with Jewish shops, Jewish homes. On the right side, we see the interior of the Bohorodchany synagogue, the one that was visited so often but by Julian David's ancestors, whose signatures you saw on previous slides. So again, another level, another dimensions of focusing on people and places. But let us leave small market towns and move for a brief moment to the capital city, to the capital of Galicia, Lwów in Polish, Lemberg in German, and Lviv in Ukrainian. On the top, another vintage old postcards with the building that at that time housed Galician Sejm or a provincial parliamentary assembly. Within this building, within these walls, Galician Jewish deputies argued their cases on behalf of their communities since the 1860s. Below, a glimpse of a cultural scene from Lwów, particularly during the interwar period, Jewish writers, musicians, critics, radio personalities contributed not just to cultural scene of Lwów, but Poland as a whole. Fanny Fuchs was a Jewish woman born in Lwów. We first found and countered Fanny Fuchs' name looking at university records as a part of our broader research program, trying to glean information, collect information on all Jewish students from Galicia who studied in various Habsburg universities. We learned from those records that Fanny Fuchs enrolled at Lwów University in 1900, very first year when women were allowed to study medicine. 6 years later, in 1906, she graduated as a medical doctor, becoming effectively only third woman leaving university with this degree. In fact, the very first 3 women were Jewish. This by itself would be a story worth retelling, but the life of Fanny Fuchs did not end here. During the interwar period, Dr. Fuchs was a busy woman, wife, mother, and a busy medical practitioner affiliated in 1920s, in 1930s with the institution that is seen here on this image. This is a Jewish hospital of Lwów, built in this very elegant and interesting neo-Moorish style. The building, by the way, still stands till today, but is covered by the trees. In December 1941, Fanny Fuchs, with tens of thousands of other Jews, became trapped in the Lwów ghetto. On the right side, you see handwriting of Fanny Fuchs on a questionnaire required of all medical personnel by the Nazis. That's how she was remembered by her friend and colleague, Mark Redner. Quote, she always had a smile and a good an encouraging word while she herself struggled hard to gain a piece of bread for herself and her son. Redner escaped from the ghetto and survived the war. He wrote a very emotional account of those harrowing times in 1940s. From this account, we learned that Fanny Fuchs was killed, murdered in August 1942. These numbers for Lvov, but similar numbers can be reproduced for other communities, indicate a broken continuity brought by Shoah. Let me come back to the story, or I should correct myself, many stories of Jewish Galicia. On here you see a Galician rabbi. On the right you see Hasidic Jews praying on Yom Kippur in the Drohobych synagogue, a beautiful masterpiece. I know that Professor Roden and I, we have special affinity to this picture. This is a beautiful masterpiece by a young then Moritz or Maurizi Gottlieb, a Jewish artist from Galicia. In the center, you see Arthur Nimhin, a lawyer, editor of a local newspaper who became a mayor of the third largest city in Galicia, governing the city of Stanisławów from the 1890s until 1919. Not an easy task, I must say, and you probably agree with me that governing Poles, Ukrainians and Jews, all of those groups having their own ideas what is the best for neighborhood, their neighborhood was not an easy task. Next to Nimhin is Joachim Hibner. This is my grandfather who moved to Lvov in 1914. He and his siblings were the first generation in the family who had normal modern lives during the interwar period of time. They educated their kids in the universities, but their lives came to an abrupt halt in 1939. Joachim survived the war, but at a steep personal price. The story of Jewish Galicia is also the story of Jewish women. Hopefully we'll come back to this perhaps in a discussion. Jewish women modernized many families in Galicia, particularly at the turn of 20th century. To understand Jewish Galicia, it is, however, important for us to remind ourselves that Jews lived surrounded by Poles and Ukrainians. This provided very important impact on cultural and other development of Jewish community of Galicia, but it was also a harbinger of an issues, particularly at the time when the nationalism was rising to the surface at the end of 19th century and at the beginning of 20th century. Let me finish by sharing, for the purpose of today's discussion, the last map of the former Galicia after World War II. In the aftermath of the war, as a result of the Yalta agreements, the eastern part of Galicia, of former Galicia, was annexed to the Soviet Union. The western part became a part of Poland. And with the collapse of Soviet Union in 1990s, eastern part was finally solidly anchored in independent Ukraine. So with this, I think, Fred, I will stop and I will pass the baton back to you. Thank you very much.
And in the interest of time, as we thank you for this wonderful presentation, we will pass the baton directly to Ralph Berger.
Thank you, Fred, and my thanks to all those who are watching. Okay, you honor my parents and others like them by being here tonight. I'd like to start with an American Indian proverb. Tell me a truth, and I will remember. Tell me a fact, and I will believe. tell me a story and it will remain in your heart forever. Tonight, I'd like to tell you a story that is both true and factual. It is about two people who were fighters in the Belsky Brigade. My parents, Murray and Frances Berger. Let me tell you a little about them. Wait. My dad, Murray Berger, or Muttel in Yiddish, was born in a shtetl, a village called Scheller, in what was then Belarusia, White Russia. He was the youngest of 7 children. Prior to World War II, my dad was a rabbinical student, studying at the famous Mir Yeshiva. Obviously, the war changed that. That's him on the right with 2 cousins in Scheller in the late 1930s. My mom, Frances Golkovich Berger, or Fruma in Yiddish, was raised in Karelich, Poland, a shtetl in the county of Novogrudek. She had 3 sisters and 1 brother. Though her father was very religious, my mom was pretty progressive. She belonged to 2 different Zionist groups, wrote prose and poetry, and acted in community theater. That's her playing a fortune teller in a Karelich Drama Circle production. She was 16 years old when this picture was taken. My mom very much wanted to emigrate to Palestine, but was unable to do so on account of the British mandate. So she obtained papers to go to South Africa. 3 of her aunts had already emigrated there, but the Nazis closed that door. The world that my parents lived in was destroyed by the Holocaust. As described by the author Thomas Mann, the Nazis transformed Europe into a thick-walled torture chamber. Over 42,000 ghettos and camps were established by the Nazis throughout German-controlled areas. My mother and her family were forced into the Novogrudek ghetto, which was known as a concentration ghetto or a slave labor ghetto. My father, after escaping from the Nazis and hiding on his own for a year, at times being hidden by righteous Gentiles, realized that his only chance of survival was to be with other Jews. Over 130 of his relatives had already been murdered. He secretly latched onto a slave labor gang and sneaked into the ghetto. The conditions there were horrendous. The time came when my father sensed that a massacre was soon to take place. He was determined to escape. As he writes, "If death had to come, let the bullet come from behind." In other words, the end would come while he was escaping rather than submitting. He and others wanted to join the partisans, resistance fighters, and fight the Nazis. They wanted to do this despite the fact that there was tremendous anti-Semitism among the Russian and Polish partisans. Many of them would readily kill a Jewish fighter for a good pair of boots. But then word came that the Belsky brothers were forming a Jewish partisan unit. My father was among the first 7 men to escape from the Novogrudek ghetto and join the Belskis. Another 8 including my uncle, Ben-Zion Gulkovich, followed soon thereafter. Those 15 men elected Tuvia Belsky to be their commander. The Belsky Brigade was born. It grew, and both independently and along with Russian detachments, fought the Nazis. It engaged in sabotage, blowing up bridges and rail lines, destroying telephone lines, bombing Nazi police headquarters, and, at times, engaging in open combat. And, very importantly, the Belsky Brigade rescued other Jews. Neither my brother Al nor I will ever forget something that occurred at a bas mitzvah in California several years after my parents had died. An older woman came running towards us, trailed by her middle-aged son. She could barely catch her breath, but managed to say, "You're Murray Berger's sons. You're Murray Berger's sons. Your father carried me and my son out of the ghetto." Up until that day, we had never heard that story. The Belsky detachment grew into a forest community of more than 1,200 Jews. It was the most massive rescue operation of Jews by Jews during World War II. In the summer of 1942, 10 years to the day before I was born, the Nazis massacred over 4,000 Jews from the Novogroda ghetto. My mom and my aunt, Judy Gulkovich, survived by hiding in a cesspool for 6 days without food or water. They were rescued by my uncle, Ben-Zion. Shortly thereafter, with about 24 others, they escaped and joined the brigade. The soldier with rifle in hand, bracketed in red, is my mother. She was the first woman in the brigade to be issued a weapon. And to give you a frame of reference, especially since I know we have many students watching, my mom was 21 years old when Hitler invaded Poland and 24 when this picture was taken. My dad was 5 years older. My parents met as fighters in the brigade and were married in Rome in 1947. My dad, when asked, would smile slyly and tell people, "I found my wife in the woods." He wasn't kidding. My parents never stopped engaging in Holocaust education. They lectured in schools, wrote articles, and gave interviews. My mom became known in Yiddish-speaking circles for her poetry about the Holocaust in general and Jewish resistance in particular. People have asked me where the title of the book comes from. It is actually from one of my mom's poems, Jewish Partisans. The poem is rather lengthy, but I'd like to read a few stanzas to you. The heart is sad, but the body is with comfort filled, for 'tis the day when vengeance's hour will be fulfilled. Also the hour of fate, uncertain I must say, whither the angry storm our lives will bear away. And if this is our fate, since the world has us betrayed, with courage shall we fight, with gun and with grenade, for it is not a struggle of equals, justice fair, but against the slaughterer, a lamb's struggle in despair. Yet suddenly lamb as lion transformed we see, fight with pistol in its hands for a better morning, free. I think the legacy of the Jewish partisan experience is twofold. First, Jews did not go like sheep to the slaughter during the Holocaust. When they could, Jews fought back, both physically and spiritually. I remember when I was a kid, my dad was asked, why didn't more Jews escape? And the first thing he answered was, to where? Remember, Hitler's armies bulldozed Europe. It is amazing that nearly 30,000 Jews were able to escape and fight the Nazis. Second, it is a lesson in empowerment for young people in particular. Most of the Jewish partisans were in their teens and 20s. United, these individuals, despite tremendous obstacles, made a positive difference. The takeaway for me, whenever possible, be an upstander, not merely a bystander. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph. We very much appreciate your contribution and look forward to picking up in our conversations and discussion. And we turn now to Leora Tech.
Thank you very much, Fred and Avi and my fellow panelists and everyone who is joining us today. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see my PowerPoint. I'm going to tell you about a project I've been working on for the past couple of years called the HaShoah Project. But first, a little bit of background. Both of my parents were born in Poland. My mother was born in Lublin, which is in eastern Poland, and my father was born in Baranovich, which is now Belarus, but was Poland when he was born there. But despite this fact, and the fact that they spoke Polish when they didn't want us to understand, I never felt a connection to Poland growing up. I had a strong Jewish identity, and I liked traveling and learning languages, but I never thought of the possibility of going to Poland. And I didn't maybe really know so as concretely as I do now how many generations of my family had been born there, but I knew that we had lost a lot of family members during World War II. Actually, I didn't know that as a small child because my mother was silent about her experiences for 30 years. She's a Holocaust survivor, but she didn't talk about those wartime experiences for a long time. This is my mom during the war. It's the only photograph that we have. And after she broke that silence, as she says, her memories began to demand attention. She read one Holocaust memoir, and then she was reading more and more, and then she wanted to write her own story of surviving the war by pretending to be a Catholic girl with false papers. So she wrote her memoir, Dry Tears, and Fred mentioned that she wrote a book about the Bielski brothers. So she was already a sociologist, but she kind of pivoted and became a Holocaust scholar with a focus on rescue and resistance. So in 2005, her memoir, Dry Tears, was translated into Polish, and she invited me to go with her and my father to Poland on the book tour. And I said, sure, I'll go. But I wasn't going there like many Jews with Polish roots go on a roots trip to look for, connections or something. I was just, accepting this invitation and didn't have many expectations. And when we were there, we were very warmly received. We were in Krakow, Lublin, and Warsaw. So everywhere people were really great, but particularly in Lublin, my mother's home city, the people were so warm because, she was from Lublin. So she was telling her story. And we met people from this organization called Brama Grodzka Teatr NN. Brama means gate in Polish. So this gate that you can see here is actually Brama Grodzka, or town gate. And it stands in a very important place that was once the passageway between the Christian and Jewish parts of the city. And it's now a municipal institution. Those buildings above and to the sides house a municipal institution that is committed to preserving the memory of the Jews of Lublin. There were 43,000 Jews in Lublin before the war. And now there are 40 Jews in Lublin. So we got a tour of the inside of Brama Grodzka, of the exhibition. This is my parents and I, and Witek Dąbrowski, who's the deputy director, is showing us an aerial view of Jewish Lublin, which was a very crowded, dense area of streets and buildings. And today, this same area has a lot of empty space. That grass around this castle in the middle, the grass around it, the parking lot in front of it, the bus station to the right, all of that was filled with these Jewish streets and Jewish life and Yiddish being spoken and things being bought and sold and lives being lived. And it's empty. And Tomek Pietraszewicz, who's the founder and director of Brama Grodzka, said that when he discovered that on the other side of this gate, he was actually going to start a theater company. And when he discovered that at the other side of Brama Grodzka had been this rich Jewish town with these thousands and thousands of people, and that as an adult man, actually you'll see this in the video I'm going to show, but he was ashamed of the fact that he hadn't known this. And he decided he had to do something about it. So instead of starting a theater company, he pivoted and started this organization whose first core mission was remembrance of the Jews of Lublin. And Brama Grodzka does really amazing projects that are connected to art, and they're very human, and every project is different from the other. So I wish I had time to tell you about all of them, but I'll tell you a few. One of them is that Tomek got 43 of these tiles that he installed in the pavement, 43 because of the 43,000 Jews in Lublin, that mark the ghetto boundary, so that people walking around just, come upon this, and the history is like something that they can't ignore. I've seen people walking and sort of bending over and looking at these markers. Another project of theirs is called The Mystery of Light and Darkness. We just had it a couple of weeks ago virtually, but it takes place on the 16th of March, because the 16th of March, 1942 was when the liquidation of the ghetto in Lublin began. Actually, it was the beginning of Operation Reinhardt. So on March 16th, people gather on what was once the Christian side of the gate, line up, as you can see here, and read the names of Jews who were in the ghetto. And then by the time we finish, people read for about, I think, an hour and a half. Everybody moves to the Jewish side where the lights have been turned off, and we stand in the darkness for a couple of minutes, and then the lights are turned on. And Witek, who you saw before, the deputy director, who's also an actor and a storyteller, he says, there is light because there is memory. There is light, but not life. So this importance of not confusing, that Glenn Kurtz actually talks about this in his book, 3 Minutes in Poland, not to confuse remembrance with reanimation. Another one of their projects is called 43,000 Folders. And Tomek wanted to provide a place for each of the 43,000 Jews that lived in Lublin before the war, because as we know, most of them don't have tombstones. Many don't have even family members to remember them. And so lining the exhibition of Brama Grodzka are these folders. Half of them are empty because we don't have information, but the other half have something. It might be just a picture, it might be just a name, but it's something to remember a person who lived. And then collectively, they represent that lost community. So there's a place for that rich lost community. So I started, I went in 2005. I kept coming back. I got to know Tomek and Vitek very well. I started Bridge to Poland, which is an organization dedicated to Polish Jewish history, but with a focus on non-Jews commemorating Jewish life. But at the beginning, I really only knew Brama Grodzka. And so, on my trips, Brama Grodzka would kind of be the heart of it. And I saw how moved people were. But as the years went by, I learned that there were people all over Poland doing this work of remembrance in one way or another, whether it was cleaning up a cemetery or some sort of artistic project or scholarship or, teaching, like all kinds of things. And I felt that these voices of these who I came to call rescuers of memory needed to be preserved. We talk a lot about the survivors are almost gone and preserving their voices. And of course, that's very important. But I felt and feel that the voices of these people in Poland who knew the survivors, who are doing this work and are moved to devote their lives to this work, also their voices need to be preserved. So luckily I got a grant from Wellesley College to spend 7 months in Poland doing interviews. And then I got another one from the US Embassy in Warsaw. So I'm going to show you a video in a couple of minutes that will introduce you to some of the people, but let me just tell you a little bit about a couple of them. This is Dariusz Popiela. He is an Olympic kayaker. He's on the Polish national team. And he was, when he was about 20, he read a memoir of a survivor. And then he started thinking, well, what about my city, Nowy Sącz, which actually you saw on the last map that Andrew showed, Nowy Sącz. And he realized that 1/3 of the population had been Jewish, but there was no monument, there was no plaque, there was no memory. And so he said, I had to act. When he found that out, he had to act. And so he created an organization called People Not Numbers. And to the extent possible, they clean up Jewish cemeteries and mass grave sites, and then to the extent possible, list the people's names. Instead of saying, 428 Jews were murdered here, they list the names and the ages, and it's very powerful. I don't know how well you can see this picture, but you see whole families together. You can see children 2, 3 months. So it personalizes the loss. Another person I want to mention is Rafał Kowalski. He used to be a journalist with Gazeta Wyborcza, which is sort of like the New York Times, I guess, of Poland. But then he said he had a dibuk inside of him. So many of you probably know dibuk is a Yiddish word. A lot of my Polish friends use these Yiddish and Hebrew words. It's like a demon that he was possessed. He lives in Płock, and he felt that he had to go around the world and collect stories of survivors from Płock before it was too late, before to outrun God, which is a quote from a Hannah Krall book. So he did that, and he has written this book with these memories of survivors from Płock. So I learned a lot of lessons from these people, and unfortunately I don't have time to go into more detail because I would like to show you this short video that I prepared that introduces the project. So hopefully you can see this.
Many non-Jews engaged in the rescue of Jewish memory in Poland knew nothing about Jewish history in Poland when they were growing up.
Ja dorastałem w latach 70. i 80. I nie przypominam sobie, żeby rodzice mówili o Żydach. W szkole też się nie uczyłem o Żydach. To w ogóle była taka kwestia, o której się nie mówiło.
The Jewish memory was like excluded from my perception of the reality.
My parents, they are learning from us now, because as you know, they were growing up in this communist time in Poland when the Jewish subject was like a taboo.
But at some point, they discovered what was missing and were compelled to act.
To byli ludzie, którzy byli skazani najpierw na zagładę, a potem na zapomnienie powojenne. To było uderzające, to mnie uderzyło. Dlaczego? Zacząłem się pytać, dlaczego tak się stało, że osoby, że ludzie, którzy mieszkali tutaj tyle lat, 800 lat, ponad 800 lat, nagle są skazani na zapomnienie i byłem ciekawy, dlaczego?
Zaczęła się zupełnie nowa sytuacja dla mnie. Osoby, która zaczęła powoli odkrywać to, że w tym mieście żyli Żydzi i że ich polscy sąsiedzi zapomnieli. To było coś takiego głęboko, czułem się głęboko nie w porządku tej sytuacji, że dorosły człowiek mieszkający w tym mieście nic nie wie o Żydach. Że uznałem, że to jest coś nie tak w tej sytuacji.
What happens in the Holocaust, it's quite simple. There are victims, there should be memory. And I feel that I need to commemorate the Jewish citizens. I say, yeah, for me, this is the patriotic action, because what I am doing, we are commemorating the citizens of this country, which I represent.
It is these dedicated souls who, by honoring the Jewish community that was erased from their land, give us hope for the future of humanity.
I grown up with the awareness of duty to care about the roots, to care about the history, to care about the family and the people who has no one to care about the families in the ground.
Myślę, że najważniejszą rzeczą jest to, że ludzie, mieszkańcy zrozumieli, że to jest też ich kultura, że Żydzi i Polacy żyli obok siebie, że 50/50, czyli połowa na połowę mieszkańców było tych i tych. I oni razem z sobą współpracowali, żyli, a więc nie możemy uciekać od tej historii i powinniśmy ją cały czas kultywować i przekazywać.
If we would like to see some light somewhere in the future, it's possible just only when we will treat each other as people, as human beings. I understand that when we try to teach people in Poland, we say, yeah, because I teach you about Jewish culture. I tell you something about Jewish cemetery. I will tell you something about Jewish history in Poland. Of course, but you cannot forget that in the first place, I am telling you about people.
Thank you.
It's my delight to thank all three of our panelists as we embark on our opportunity to speak with one another, but also to have the opportunity to respond to questions. I first have to say great praise to our three panelists because they are so dedicated to the work of education and exchange, that they really did keep their presentations to 15 minutes each, which nobody does. And that was very, very impressive. And I'll say that, again, this is a dedication to what matters and why they do the kind of work that they're doing. I find it very interesting that we have one organization with the English word bridge. We have another organization with the word gesher, also bridge. This whole panel is about building bridges, isn't it, right? Because we have this sense of the bridge to the past, the bridge to the present where we are encountering this material, the bridge to the future that we wish to create. And I think that there are really a couple of pieces to that that I think are worth considering. The first is the sense in which that bridge is one that extends outside of our own categories of identity, as much of your work has shown insofar as how this speaks to deeply human stories, and Leora's work particularly focuses on the experiences of non-Jews in Poland, and how one can empower others to tell these stories of their native lands. But we also, I think, want to think about how each of us has to find our own bridge to this story, right? We have to find a bridge for ourselves to how we relate to this story and what kind of bridges we will create to the future with respect to them. So I just want to say a couple of words about how the chat will be working. Folks should feel free to use the chat function to post questions. If we have a couple of related questions in the chat, I'll synthesize those to an extent. You should find in the chat by now links for the organizations of Leora and Andrew, as well as a link to the book for Ralph, so you can find information there. As we're waiting for folks to get their questions to us, maybe I could just ask our panelists to comment on this matter of the idea of bridge and how I see bridge working as metaphor. I see bridge working as the form of resistance, right? Because when one finds something that one can't cross over by oneself, right? One has to build a bridge of some kind. And that's what each of you has done, right? You have built bridges. So perhaps any of you would like to comment on the matter of bridges as forms of resistance, as well as your own journeys to building these kinds of bridges.
Well, if I may, I will start. I think, Fred, you're right. Everything here, what we are talking is about building, rebuilding, creating the bridge, looking into the past is essentially fulfilling our own desire to learn about our past and about our family histories, about cultural aspects of those communities that no longer exist. But at the same time, coming back to Leora's theme, it is looking forward, how to make sure that we create information, that we create reconstruction that does not end with us or with singular discoveries, but is carried forward. And I will maybe finish on one other aspect, that there is a danger that, as someone said, history is not what it was, but how we choose to remember. It's very important also that we try to, as we discover and create forward narrative, that we try to avoid certain biases that are unavoidable.
Ralph, you're muted. Ralph, there we go. Now
okay, I'm one of those Luddites.
I am too.
I grew up in a home where my parents talked about their experiences. Their friends talked about their experiences. I know that many Holocaust survivors did not want to do so. Similarly, many American GIs coming home from war did not want to do so. And I think part of the reason that we didn't hear more about the Holocaust in the years after the war was, one, people were traumatized by it. Nations had to recover. People had to go on with their lives. But also, I saw that many people, it's not just that people did not want to talk, many people did not want to hear it. They just did not want to hear it. Even in Israel, they did not want to hear about the survivors' experiences to a large degree until the Eichmann trial took place and they were educated. And in terms of building bridges, whatever little I can do to build a bridge to the next generation so they know what took place, so they know their histories, I am privileged to do.
Fred, my response to your question about bridge building and resistance is that I think the thing that I'm trying to resist or fight against are stereotypes against Poles. And obviously, I'm not saying that there wasn't and isn't anti-Semitism. I'm not saying that. But what I do want to fight against is the broad brush of all Poles as anti-Semites that I come across. And, especially knowing some of these people like Tomek and Vitek, and now I've met all these other people, and I know how pure their motivations are. It's very painful, on their behalf, when I hear those things, and so I would like to expose people to these examples, even if it's not the majority of Poland. I don't know, because sometimes people say to me, "Oh, you're just, you're just talking to the good Poles or something." But as you know, my mother, her book after Dry Tears was When Light Pierced the Darkness, and she said that she wouldn't have been able to deal with the Holocaust if she wasn't looking at something positive, right? So it's like we all choose what we want to focus on. And so for me, it's that's what gives me hope for the future, is to focus on these rescuers of Poland. I would be curious to hear from Andrew what you were thinking of when you said that we have to be careful about biases. I don't know if you were sort of referring to this historical policy of the current government or something else.
Well, I was referring to a situation that it's easy to create a narrative in a land where there are no Jews about the Jews. It's much more difficult to create interpersonal, intergroup relationship when the communities live next to each other. So I grew up, on a personal note, I usually at those talks don't talk about personal stuff. I grew up in Poland during those dark times that one of your respondents was describing, and that's very true. There was no story being told about Jews. Yes, there was a monument at the site of previous former Jewish ghetto, but that's it. There was nothing else. I grew up knowing very little about my Jewish past. My father was Jewish, my mother was Christian. So I think it is uplifting to see the new generation of Poles embracing the past, embracing, maybe skipping 1 or 2 generations of their parents and great-parents, and embracing multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious past, and trying to maintain those memories. But again, the challenge for all of us, and this is not a critique, this is just simply a challenge, is that we have to make sure that we are not creating narrative, Disney-like narrative about those good Jews and the good Poles and living all together. So I think there are nuances that in the dialogue and our own discoveries, we should have an opportunity to voice.
I remember I met a man who he owned the building where a mikveh, the remains of a mikveh, and he said, "I'm waiting for a Jew to come and tell me what to do with this." And I'm like, "No, you can't just listen to like any Jew, you know."
Right.
Just because someone's Jewish doesn't mean they know what you should do with this building. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I understand what you're saying, that danger of Disneyfication, or maybe, you know, a romanticization of the Jew. I have seen little hints of that sometimes, yeah.
So we have some interesting comments in the chat. I think one is quite pointed to some of the issues you've begun discussing, and then we'll be able to touch on other things. Professor Pat uses the term translation, which my students know is one of my favorite metaphors, to carry something across, in the sense of the translating of these memories, these stories as second generation and beyond, this sense of how that relates to perhaps the title of the panel, The Legacy of European Jewry. So in speaking to some of the experiences and the work that you've done, really what is the relationship between, say, a legacy from that which comes before to what may be, in a sense, this work of translation. And I don't, of course, mean, and I'm sure he doesn't either, literal translation by language, but making something new, carrying it across in some way. I see that one of the other comments in the chat queries the role of education in countries in the former Soviet Union with respect to Holocaust education. Another comment in chat queries insofar as the place of hidden Jews, presumably those who are discovering their Jewish identities in contemporary Poland and related lands. So I see a lot of questions pertaining to the future of the past, as it were, and I wonder whether any of you wish to speak to the, let's just say, the older category of second generation and beyond, or newer ways of thinking about the legacies for those who carry them.
I, for one, find it very heartening that there are new ways to educate young people. A number of the Holocaust museums are doing holograms where you can ask a survivor, and I say that in quotes because the survivor is not there in person. The survivor may be deceased, but they have pre-recorded testimony, and using modern technology, there can be a dialogue between that hologram and the young person asking these questions, or any person. At first, I was very disturbed by the concept. And then I saw videos of people being fascinated and people learning. And my philosophy is whatever it takes, because the second generation, we heard our parents, literally and figuratively. Some members of the third did, but there is a need to educate, particularly as the survivors are passing away. 10 years from now, how many living witnesses will there be? And I am so glad to know that Holocaust education is being innovative and is reaching out. And I'm thrilled that I got announcements about a dozen different Yom HaShoah commemorations this week. This needs to take place. The education is essential. Otherwise, the history is lost.
Right.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of times when the way the education is done does not really touch people very deeply, and that's why I really like the work of Brahma Grodzka, because it's so human, like the mystery of light and darkness that I showed you. You know, you're actually moving your body. You know, you're participating. You're reading the names of people. You know, it's there's something. And you know, different people respond to different things. So it's good that we have many different ways. But yeah, I'm glad we have that. I actually know someone who is one of those holograms.
Really?
Yeah, and I asked him, a survivor from Lublin, and I asked him why he did it, because he isn't the type of person that likes to label himself like as a Holocaust guy or something. And he said it was for his grandchildren.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me add, Fred, a little bit more to that concept of translation, and maybe a little bit from a different angle than Ralph and Laura contributed to that topic. I have to say that in addition to diving into the records and all the archival work that we do in Gesher Galicia, we also reach out to our members to provide us with the information about their families, sometimes combined with the discoveries through those records, but not from a dry history, but more from the humanistic point of view. And being involved together with my wonderful editor in our publication, the quarterly research publication, every quarter I'm blown away by the richness of the family stories. And I tend to say that each of those stories is a separate book. It's not just one page summary or 5-page article. It's a separate book. And what to me, coming back to the point that you kind of challenge us to think about, the point of translation, the translation is also to convey not only suffering, but also richness, vibrancy of Jewish communities, Jewish families. I am reminded again, every time I interact with our members, how diverse this community was, culturally, spiritually, linguistically, and you know, we can add and add. So I think that is an important bridge that is that we owe partially.
Yeah, I think that's really important when people come on Bridge to Poland trips, or came before the pandemic. That was something that people were surprised about. Oh, you know, this like Polish Jewry, it's not one thing. It's hundreds of things, probably, with all the combinations and permutations. That's very important.
So what we're hearing from each of you is really this sense of a combination between tradition and innovation. That on one hand, the absolute imperative to document, to tell the story, to retell the story, but both in the form, whether it's through digital technologies or whether in terms of the strategy and nature of conversations, the opening of doors, opening of tents, rather than, let's just say, the more particularist visions and so forth, that the opportunity to build the bridges requires both tradition and innovation, it would seem. And one of our participants this evening, one of our attendees, gave a shout out to the UConn students who protested the anti-Semitic incidents that had happened at the campus. And another one of the folks posed the question, so how do we speak with the rise of nationalism and what some have called the new anti-Semitism of the moment? So as we're thinking about this issue of how this story, this history is translated and transformed for our moment, are there particular things that we need to be mindful of with respect to the particular forms of anti-Semitism that appear in our own moment, and how we may want to address that through this history?
Not an easy question, I have to say.
Yeah, complex topic, Fred, no question about that. And I think we are not the first and not the last that we will struggle providing the answer. What's the proper attitude toward veiled and unveiled form of anti-Semitism? I think that besides kind of legal framework that exists 30,000 feet above us in civilized society, I think on individual levels, as we walk on earth, I think what we just talked to remembering human aspect of Jewish past, getting involved in conveying both comfortable and uncomfortable truth forward. To me, this is probably the best recipe to minimize anti-Semitism going forward. But I agree with Leora, no, this is not a simple question that we can come up with a boxed answer at this present moment.
I agree with both of you. This is not simple at all, but I think there's a danger in trying to be too polite. And what I mean by that is I think there is a need to call it like it is.
Yeah.
For example, anyone who thinks, in my opinion, that BDS is not a form of anti-Semitism is just plain wrong. It is. And I think there's an obligation on everyone's part to educate one another as to what the real motivation is. What is this all about?
I interviewed a few teachers for the Neshoma project, and I asked them, is everybody on board? They're teaching all this stuff about Jewish history and the Jews of their town. And for example, Marek Koltson, he was the first person to speak in the interview. He said, he's from Zamość, and he said that no, sometimes at the beginning of the year or something, they're like, why are you so focused on the Jews? Why are you, but once they get into it and once they see that it's a part of their local history, a lot of people told me in Poland that there's a problem in the fact that they don't learn local history. They don't know the history of their own place. And then once they start to learn it and it includes the history of the Jews, then they start to take some ownership of it.
And that extends also, Liora, to Ukraine, even probably to a greater extent, where the memories of Jewish past is even more underground, if you will, than in parts of Poland. Another complexity, how to deal with the past, how to make sure that this past is real for the contemporary generation.
There's just been a little bit of exchange in the chat that I have to say resonates for myself as a teacher of literature. And that's to say the questioning insofar as the accuracy of testimony, whether in memorial books or otherwise, etc. It really reminds me as a teacher of literature that we value testimony, but we value story. And story, and of course, whether it's in Ruth Franklin's book from a decade ago, or whether in the debates about creating poetry out of the ashes in the post-war years, 75 years ago, or thereabouts, there have been these long-standing debates about creative invention, creative reinvention with respect to the Holocaust. And we may not be at a moment where, say, books, films may be the exclusive media, but we find so many other kinds of media, including in digital media, gaming projects that have been undertaken for educational practices to better understand the logger, for instance. I mean, there are quite extraordinary things that people have been doing and that have ethical questions, controversies, and as well as the imperatives to understand their goals to educate. So I think that as we have these discussions about how we teach about tolerance and intolerance and Holocaust and more broadly genocide studies, that the art that is created, whatever the particular medium of the moment, becomes a means for us to communicate the kinds of values. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that relationship between testimony and truths on the one hand, and perhaps narrative and art and let's just say creative reinvention on the other hand.
Well, we have to accept, I think, that there's going to be a certain amount of distortion, whether it's in a memoir, because that's the way the person's remembering it. I mean, obviously, probably the most reliable are these contemporaneous things like Ringelblum archives. That's why I actually wanted to ask Ralph if your mother wrote the poems during the war or after. But when my mom was writing When Light Pierced the Darkness, she used to teach methodology, so she was not the type of person that before that was really into qualitative, research. But obviously, if you're going to be in the field of the Holocaust, you have to accept that you're not going to have these perfect like control groups or something like that. I even have made mistakes myself. Like, I remember when I was in law school in the South and this freight train went by, and I had to stop because the train was going by. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm sitting there for 5-10 minutes and I'm getting all this Holocaust imagery in my head. And I'm thinking, I'm going to call mom when I get home because she'll understand how when I see this freight train, I think about the Holocaust. So I call her, I say, oh, there was this train. It was so awful. It just reminded me of the Holocaust. She said, oh, this is interesting because for me, a train is a symbol of hope, because she was waiting for her father to come and get her when she was in Otwock with this family. And whenever she heard the train whistle, she thought, oh, maybe my father's coming. So I had incorporated from movies, probably television, the show, I don't know, this image, but the actual survivor, who was my mother, had a completely different, view of things.
And your wonderful mother, who said such things as no one survived without the help of at least one other person that reminds us so much of the importance of perspective, and that oft quoted phrase that I was reminded of in hearing so many of you speak, that everyone thinks that their story is unique, full stop, and they're all right. You know, they're all correct about this, that every story that we do encounter is a unique story insofar as it. And the I think that what, as we begin to think towards closing, this future of the past, as it were, we can't help but remember that there continues to be art created. There continues to be tremendous amount of work created with respect to this history, European Jewish history and history of the Holocaust. There continues to be much work as well as much art that is done through different kinds of perspectives. One of our folks in the chat remarked about Jewish music festivals that are staged by non-Jews in areas where there aren't Jews, you know, and a friend of mine, Dr. Shelley Salamensky, has written about this extensively insofar as the performance of Jewish identity in various places. So we're looking at both the ethics as well as the aesthetics of memory when we're doing this kind of work. So I'm wondering, as we're keeping an eye on the clock for all of our good guests and panelists, whether folks may have a final comment they'd like to share with our audience before wrapping up.
I want to commend Andrew and Leora on the phenomenal work that they're doing with regard to preserving Jewish memory. I think it's just outstanding. And I think all of us have an obligation to educate. You know, we were just talking about fact and distortion. Sometimes we have to accept a little bit of dramatization that might not be 100% accurate if we're going to reach an audience. The film Defiance, based on your mom's book, Leora, that was the first time many, many people heard about the partisans. It's an educational device. Was it 100% accurate? I think your mom will be the first to agree that some liberties were taken with the book, but it educated people. And that's what's important. And we have to try to stick to the fact as much as possible and see that distortion is minimal.
Yeah, I have a whole talk that I do about distortion and stuff, so I don't think I have enough time here, but I want to thank Andrew and Ralph for really fascinating presentations, and Fred for great moderating. And I really want to think about this ethics and aesthetics in remembrance. It's very interesting. And Avi, thank you so much for all the organizing and the support, and whoever else I don't know that was part of it, and the audience, of course.
Huge thanks to Fred and to Avi.
Well, let me echo all the thanks to Fred. This program was, this was a long pregnancy for this program, right? More than a year, that's very long. And thank you, Avi. I always take tremendous joy, and it's a learning curve all the time. Everything in my book is about learning. To meet Ralph, to meet Leora, to meet Fred, and to discuss those difficult topics, it's a big learning curve. And that's, I'm very grateful for this opportunity.
Well, Andrew, if you'll forgive me the rather cheesy cliche, I'm relieved that you're a cardiologist and not an obstetrician in that metaphor that you've just given about the long pregnancy, about the development of this program. And I will continue the cheesiness of the cliche to say that to move from the literal to the figurative hearts, this kind of work has to come from a place of compassion, from a place of love, from a place of care. It has to come from a place of respect, not only for the past, but also respect for the present moment and care for the future as we carry this forward in a particular kind of way. And I know of no one who does this kind of work who doesn't come from a space that is deeply committed to, let's just say, I'll pick up the word, the ethics, Leora. We can talk about aesthetics another time, of what it is and what it means to carry this forward. I'm just so tremendously grateful to all of you for the kind of work that you do publicly, because as far as I'm concerned, it's tremendous public service to continue this work of education, documentation, and learning outside of the university. And it's our imperative within the universities to continue to create spaces and learning environments to promote this work that you are doing outside, and how we can teach our students about it. Thank you to all of you, and I'm tremendously grateful to Avi for his support. He's been a tremendous colleague in the 2 years that he's been with us in leadership of UConn's Judaic Studies program. And I'm also tremendously grateful for our wonderful audience who joined us in great numbers. And I know some of you from Stamford, Connecticut, and I know some of you gave a wave from Sydney, and Simma just gave a literal wave I saw in her image there on the screen. So we look forward to seeing local folks again, and perhaps also being able to continue sharing the work that we do through various technologies. So thanks to all for being part of this evening, and to choosing life. We appreciate your doing that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.